So good morning, everybody. Just going to put my timer on here so I have a sense of how I'm doing. So, Stefan, can I grab the microphone from you? Thank you. So I was talking to Stefan and I said, I have 4 parts of my presentation, and which part should I do? Because I only have 25 minutes, and usually I spend an hour or so on this, and he said, do them all. So I'm gonna try to go through the 4 parts of my presentation and see if I can do it. I think you're gonna see a lot of connections between what I talk about and what Wendy talked about, and of course Wendy portrayed it much more eloquently than I can, but I think there's a lot of connections here, so I think it's a nice transition. So I'm going to talk about the school change using distributed leadership. And so I have 4 goals today. One is to talk about what is the work of school leadership. The second thing I want to talk about is what is distributed leadership, because there's a lot of different conceptions in our field about distributed leadership. The third part is how to think about working with distributed leadership as a companion to school improvement. And lastly, I want to talk about the conditions and skills that foster distributed leadership. So here we go. So the first part, the work of school leaders. What do school leaders do? How do they spend their time? There's a lot of ways in the research field that we think about breaking down the time of school leaders. There's been a lot of studies of decomposing leadership time and effort, but I want to think about it in a slightly different way. I want to think about school leadership in terms of 3 major areas. And I think the school leaders in this audience will really, I think this will resonate with you. So the first activity of school leaders is putting out fires. All those things that come at you all the time, in the moment decision making, all a parent comes in for an unscheduled talk, or teachers are having some kind of issue, or a student is experiencing some difficulty. These are the things that are of necessity a big part of the work of school leadership. The second part is what I think of as maintaining the organization. And this is really acting in all the routines and all the management tasks of the daily work of schools. Schools are very routinized, and there's a lot of regular meetings and leadership team meetings, and those are a regular part of the school day and the school week. But the third part is working on improvement, and this is really where I want to focus. And the challenge for school leaders, as I see it, is to have enough time set aside and enough effort to be able to work on improvement, not just put out fires and not just maintain the organization. So here's where I really want to focus, is this area of working on improvement. The second part that I want to talk about is what is distributed leadership? And there's really 2 conceptions of distributed leadership. One is distributed leadership a way of organizing leadership inside of schools, or is distributed leadership a perspective on school activity? And a lot of reforms around distributed leadership think about, well, if we take these teachers or we take these leaders in a school and we position them in certain ways, we have leadership teams or we have teacher leaders, that this is a way of distributing leadership. Another perspective, which I actually think is a more deep and useful way to think about school leadership, is to think about distributed leadership as a lens, as a perspective on looking at the way that leadership is arrayed inside of schools. So as a perspective on leadership, we can see that there are things that are foregrounded and things that are backgrounded. So I'm going to focus on distributed leadership right now as a perspective on how leadership is organized inside of schools. It's not about how leadership should be organized in schools. It's a descriptive way of how leadership actually is manifested in different organizations, and in this case, schools. So one way to illustrate this is to think about schooling in two different ways. One way to think about it is the formal organizational chart of schools. And every organization has a formal structure that looks like this. And you have the head teacher or the principal, you have assistant principals, you have department chairs, and you have teachers, and there's a formal hierarchy. But a different way of thinking about it is a social network. And in a social network, people can take on leadership roles even if they don't have formal responsibility. So in this example, we can see that there are some people who are teachers who are central in the network of these schools, even though they don't have formal leadership responsibility. So these are two different perspectives on how leadership might be organized inside of schools. Now, there are a couple of key aspects of the perspective of distributed leadership. One aspect is the concept that leadership arises out of the interactions between leaders and followers in particular situations. Thank you so much. So in this case, or in this example, we have leadership as leaders in particular situations taking responsibility for particular activities inside of schools. These can be formal leaders or informal leaders. And followers can be formal leaders or informal leaders. And this type of distributed leadership occurs in particular contexts, in particular situations. And so this is a way to think about leadership practice. Leadership practice occurs in the interactions between leaders, followers, and situation. And in this perspective on distributed leadership, it's the situation, it's the task that people are focused on where they're taking leadership responsibility. And we see this all the time in organizations. In a particular situation in a school, a teacher might say, I really want to make this particular thing happen, and I'm going to take ownership, and I'm going to take leadership for this particular activity. And they don't have a title of a leader. They might not even think of themselves as a leader, but they're taking on a leadership role. The other key aspect of distributed leadership is that leadership occurs in the interactions, or leadership practice occurs in the interactions. And this is a really important concept for folks to think about, because if we think about leadership not as behaviors, but as the interactions amongst people, we have a really different perspective. And in school research, we see this in lots of different ways. So one example of this is in schools where we've studied, and the field has studied many times, the relationship between what teachers do and the performance of students. And so there's a lot of instruments that focus on the behaviors of teachers. Do they talk a lot? Do they have grouping with students? And there's been a lot of focus on looking at teacher behaviors and trying to relate them to student outcomes. And the thing that we find is that there's a very weak relationship between what teachers do and how students perform, because we're leaving out a big part of what teaching is, which is teachers interacting with students, and teachers and students interacting with other students. And so if we just focus on the behaviors of teachers, we leave out a whole bunch of teaching practice, and it's the same way with leadership practice. And so I would venture to say that if you're a school leader and you go inside a classroom and you watch a lesson, you don't just look at what the teacher does, but you look at how the teacher interacts with the students and how the students interact with each other. And that's a big part of the practice of teaching. And so the analogy is that in leadership, we need to not just look at the behaviors of leaders, but we need to look at the interactions between leaders and other leaders and followers, or principals and teachers, whatever it might be. And that leadership practice is found in the interactions amongst school actors. So distributed leadership really focuses, the perspective of distributed leadership focuses on the interactions between leaders and followers in particular situations and really attends to the interactions. So the third part of what I want to talk about is distributed leadership as a companion for school improvement. And there's really two parts to this. The first part is that there's the improvement process itself. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, but there's a lot of models for school improvement which generally follow this cyclical inquiry approach to investigating problems, trying to understand the nature of problems, and deciding some way to take action to try to address those problems, and then learn from that. And this is sort of a cyclical improvement process. But what I want to focus on is organizing human capital around this improvement process. And I want to focus on two areas. One area is diagnosis, and the other area is design. And what I'm going to argue is that distributed leadership is really crucial for diagnosing problems and designing, at least hypothesizing designs and testing them out for improvement. Now, the first part of this is, how do we bring multiple people together to diagnose particular problems? And what I want to suggest is that there's incredible advantages to bringing multiple people together to diagnose particular challenging things for school improvement. And there's the advantages of bringing multiple people together to diagnose problems is exactly because everybody has a different perspective. And when a leader alone focuses on addressing a particular problem or diagnosing a particular problem, the challenge is that leader just has one particular perspective. And by bringing multiple perspectives together, we get different takes on the problem, and we're more likely to get to the root cause of this particular problem. And I think that this is nicely articulated by this quote from Albert Einstein, where he says, "If I was given 1 hour to save the planet, I would spend 59 minutes defining the problem." Whoop, my fault. Ruining my punchline here. I would spend 59 minutes defining the problem and 1 minute resolving it. So spending a lot of time with multiple perspectives, getting deep into a particular problem and what the core issue is underlying a problem is a key to correctly diagnosing a particular challenge for school improvement. And the advantage of that is found in multiple research which talks about the advantage of involving multiple perspectives in design. And so to illustrate this, I'd like to talk about the research of Catherine Phillips, who's an MIT professor of business leadership. And she's done multiple studies where she brings different perspectives or different people from different backgrounds together and to address a particular issue, and she compares that to people who come from the same background and have the same perspective. And what she finds is really fascinating. What she finds is that the diverse groups actually make more progress on identifying and getting to the root cause of particular problems than homogeneous groups. And the reason is quite naturally that groups that think similar to each other really have a reinforcing perspective. And by bringing diverse people together, she finds that you have much more dynamics with the group, but those different perspectives allow for surfacing of deeper issues. And the fascinating thing about her work is that she finds that the groups that are similar to each other are much more confident in the solutions that they bring up. And the diverse groups are much less confident in the solutions that they bring up. And this is because the homogeneous groups, the similar groups, are reinforcing each other and reinforcing their beliefs, even though the other groups come up with deeper solutions, but they're less confident because they bring together different perspectives that don't necessarily reinforce each other. And this is illustrated in some other research around the efficiency of decision making. And so what we find is that decisions that are leader-led making the decision is much more efficient. But making a decision is very different than carrying out the decision. So leader-led decisions are more efficient if you look at the outcome as the decision. But if you look at the outcome as the enactment of the decision, leader-led decisions actually take longer. Why is that? Because groups take longer to make the decision, but embedded in the process that the group goes through in making the decision, you have buy-in from the folks who are involved in the decision, who are very often going to be the people who are going to be enacting the decision. So actually, if you look at the enactment of a decision as the outcome, as opposed to the decision itself, it actually can be more efficient for a group to take longer to make a decision, but then you gain buy-in in the decision through that process. So what I've argued is that there are advantages to bringing a distributed perspective and diverse people into the process of school improvement. But this is a challenging thing, because what happens is that this raises lots of potential issues for school leaders who might be used to really focusing themselves on decision making. And so what this really requires is the process is better, but the process also is one that might bring up power differentials. It might bring up interpersonal dynamics. So leaders need a set of skills and to develop a set of organizational conditions to have their school communities engage in this more diverse perspective of engaging in school improvement with a distributed leadership approach. So this is the fourth area that I want to talk about. So what are some of the school conditions and leader skills that foster distributed leadership? So the first one that I want to talk about is psychological safety and trust. There's a researcher at Harvard named Amy Edmondson, and Edmondson talks about psychological safety as an important organizational environmental characteristic or condition that fosters the willingness of people from different levels of an organization to engage in good faith in organizational improvement processes. And what Edmondson argues is that it's only in a psychologically safe environment that people feel empowered and not put down to be able to engage and to put forth their opinions. Now, I think it's important to say that there's still accountability in a psychological safe environment, but it means that people need to feel empowered and a sense of trust inside of the organization for people to put forth their perspectives, even if they're in different places within the organization. A second skill that's important to have is the ability to listen in stereo. And what does it mean to listen in stereo? Listening in stereo means that I'm not just listening to what people say, but I'm also looking at their body language, and I'm looking at environmental cues, and I'm trying to get a sense of a broader way of understanding what I'm seeing, not just by listening to what people say. So if I'm agreeing with you, but I'm like this, then that's not a cue to you that I really do wholeheartedly agree with you if my body language says something differently. So we need to be able to read a broader set of environmental cues. A third leadership skill is to balance inquiry and advocacy. And Peter Senge, another MIT researcher, talked about this idea that what often happens inside of organizations is that a hypothesis, an idea is put forth, and when we start out, we say, that would be an interesting possible thing to try. But very quickly, that possible thing to try becomes something that we are invested in and we take ownership of, and we switch from saying, that's something that we should test out, to something that we say, that is something that I fully advocate for, and I'm tied to that thing that initially I thought was just something that we should try out. So this idea of balancing a conception of inquiry with a stance of advocacy is a very important one to understand when we're trying to engage in efforts of challenging school improvement, because very often the things that we try initially are not things that we learn from them, but they're not exactly the things that will get us to where we want to go. So in this notion of inquiry and continuous improvement, the things that we initially focus on may be learning activities, but don't necessarily get us completely to where we want to go. So let me sum up with the four things that I set out to talk about. And the first thing is that an important goal of leadership is to spend more time on improvement rather than putting out fires and engaging in organizational maintenance. The second thing is that the distributed leadership perspective highlights that leadership practice occurs in the interactions amongst leaders, followers, and situations. Third, distributed leadership is an essential approach to school improvement because multiple perspectives help us to understand the root causes of problems and also to make progress in gaining commitment for enactment. But this is not without challenges, and leaders need to create conditions and develop a set of skills that foster a culture of psychological safety and mutual learning. So this talk was based upon a report that I did with my colleagues Jim Spillane at Northwestern University and John Doria at William James College in Boston. And if you go to the CPRE website, cpre.org, there's this report, but it's also intended to be a way for school leaders to engage with these ideas. And so on our website with this report, there are activities, there are videos, there are scenarios, that school leaders can use to really grapple with some of the concepts of using distributed leadership as an approach for engaging with challenging issues of school improvement. Thank you.